You know, Americans are all too quick to become emotionally involved in a cause they know nothing about. And they join the sort of proverbial bombs away club. They tend to think that if we're bombing someone somewhere, that our greatness is being expressed to the world. Both assumptions are wrong. And here we sit 20 years later, and what have we got for our investment? As Donald Trump said, whether you like him or not, what do we get for it? How did we benefit? And the answer, of course, was no. We're going through something similar right now with Ukraine and Eastern Europe. And we've involved ourselves in something we could have prevented very easily by simply steering Ukraine away from confrontation with Russia. Instead, we did the opposite. We steered this entire country, this nation of people, into a war with Russia. Yeah. We should have been interested in avoiding that, but we weren't. And now we haven't shown much interest in bringing it to an end. Yeah. We seem to want to prolong it, although I'm not sure that's true for President Biden. But certainly for the rest of his administration and people on the Hill, it seems to be the case. Again, I don't see any benefit to this for the Ukrainians. I don't see anyone in Europe benefiting from it. I don't think we benefit from it. So,
I mean, 99% of the people you see putting Ukrainian flags up on their social media and going on about this stuff don't know anything about the region, the conflict, the history, and they don't feel a need to. It's just like, well, we decided what side we're on. That must be the good side. And so let's just send weapons in. That's enough to know. And there has been, I mean, just a tremendous amount of propaganda over the last few weeks. It's been unbelievable. Of course, I've been called in my little circles a Putin apologist, and, giving Vladimir Putin talking points. It is one thing for me to be called that, but to see people call you that with, your history and how decorated you are. I mean, go for anyone who wants to just go Google search how many service medals Colonel Douglas Macgregor has won. It's a short book of them. The idea that these people, many of them who the vast majority, never seen service, never seen combat or anything like that, but are so quick to call someone else essentially a traitor to their country because you're telling the truth about what's going on. I suppose if I said in 2002 that Saddam Hussein doesn't have nuclear weapons and isn't working with Osama bin Laden, then that I would be giving Saddam talking points. Like is that how simplistic and binary we're thinking about the world now? But the propaganda is everywhere. And I admire that you've been, even on like Fox News, when I think you're giving Stuart Varney a mild heart attack, to just tell the truth, that it's like, there's what we're hearing over and over on the news. Well, first off, the President Joe Biden said in his State of the Union that this invasion was a quote, unprovoked attack. And what we're hearing now over in the news is that while Vladimir Putin is, of course, Adolf Hitler and indistinguishable and the biggest threat ever, but he's also a weak, pathetic, puny leader who's falling on his face, and they can't even win the war in Ukraine, and they're just getting embarrassed, which are seemingly contradictory claims. But what is really going on right now in the war in Ukraine?
I think people will discover over the next couple of weeks that the losses taken by Ukrainian forces have been enormous, much, much larger than anybody cares to admit. I think we will also have a different view of Russian operations. Now, remember, Russians are different from us. We do things differently. Many of us thought that when the Russian forces entered Ukraine, that they would come in like a sledgehammer. In reality, they didn't do that at all. And one of the principal reasons was that Putin made it very clear to his generals. He said, when this is over, we would like to live with the Ukrainians. Remember, his goals were very straightforward. Number one, neutrality for the Ukrainian state. Number two, autonomy or independence for the Donbas republics that are Russian, as well as agreements that Russian-speaking citizens, people living in Ukraine who are Russian, will not be treated badly. They will not be second-class citizens anymore, and they have been. And that's something nobody ever talks about. And then finally, renounce any further claim on Crimea. Crimea was never Ukrainian, never part of Ukraine. And they all go back to Khrushchev and his drinking bout in the 1950s, after which he awarded his buddies in Kiev, who were Russians, by the way, control of Crimea. All goes by the wayside. Crimea has never been Ukrainian. It's an ahistorical claim. Those are the basic conditions. And as far as I can tell, they have never changed. There was never any interest in, quote unquote, conquering Ukraine. if you have an army of perhaps 450,000 or maybe a little larger, you're not going to be able to invest a country the size of Ukraine. I mean, from one end of Ukraine to the other is sort of like Toronto all the way down to Charlotte, North Carolina. I mean, it's just an enormous place. But I think now things have changed, because not so much because of this supposed Ukrainian resistance, although there have been some ugly events there. I mean, some of these Ukrainian forces, to be frank, have behaved like ISIS and committed terrible atrocities against the Russians when it was never called for and never necessary. Not that that is ever necessary, but it just was completely unjustified. And we're not giving it any coverage or attention. I think Tucker had something on very briefly, but that's the tip of an iceberg. But I think now Putin is listening to Zelensky and his negotiators, but I'm not sure he's taking them seriously anymore. And that's unfortunate, because this means he has to reassess what he wants to do. And he may decide he's just going to hold on to everything east of the Dnieper River. Much of that was not historically Ukrainian either. Much of it was, for hundreds and hundreds of years, Mongolian and Tartar, then became Russian under Catherine the Great. And some of it contains Ukrainians, but a lot of it contains people who are Russians. And I think he may decide that, he's going to have to do that. We don't know. I mean, I'm not privileged to those circles, but that is not an unreasonable conclusion for him to reach, particularly if he decides that he can't trust anything these Ukrainians say or do. I mean, at this point, given Zelensky's behavior and resistance to any sort of reasonable outcome, maybe he decides, let Zelensky talk, and we'll just end up doing what I just described, seizing the whole eastern side. But there's another facet to this thing that's very dangerous, and that is this constant stream of supplies, equipment, weapons coming in largely from Poland. And I would not be surprised if he acts to stop it. He's launched a lot of strikes with missiles on key installations where he knew that we were training Ukrainian forces and many foreign mercenaries, where we might try to stage quote unquote false flags and blame it on Russia. This, has happened in Syria. Mm-hmm. So I think we may see something on the ground in Western Ukraine coming down out of Belarusia that just launches from, if you know where Brest is in the part of Belarusia, look at that as a sort of center of gravity, and then moving south down towards Lvov or Lviv. We could see something like that to make it very clear that they are not going to tolerate any more resupply to opponents in Ukraine. This is dangerous because that comes very close to our borders, to NATO's borders, and you could see something happen there that may not be planned, may not be wanted, but occurs, an accident of some kind. Then you find that the war has widened very, very dramatically. That would be disastrous.
Yeah, well, these things, right? This is a very risky game. Things that's just been kind of really mind-boggling about this whole conflict just over the last few weeks is that, as against all the terror wars and the regime change wars as I've been, it's like, this is a different game. This is Russia. And the number one priority in the history of humanity is that the US and Russia do not go to war. That's the most important thing ever. And to just see so many people so haphazardly just pushing these provocations. I mean, if we were involved in some conflict with Mexico City and Russia was sending in, weapons, we would see that as quite a provocation, probably an act of war. If they were training people in the fight against our people, we'd probably see that as an act of war. Why shouldn't they see it that way from their perspective? It's a very strange an incredibly dangerous game. Hopefully, it does not come to something like that. But this is very as high stakes as a conflict could be.
Well, so this morning, I think it was on MSNBC, one of the more prominent neocons, and I can't recall his name, dismissed out of hand any concern about the use of nuclear weapons. And the commentator on MSNBC impressed me because this man said, stop paying attention to what Putin said he may or may not do, and forget that. That's not a threat. And the man said to him, well, thus far, Putin has done everything he said he would do. When everyone here in the United States, and as far as I could tell in Western Europe, said, oh, no, he'll never go in. The Russians will never go into Ukraine. That's too risky and so forth. Once again, no understanding that for the Russians, what happens in Ukraine is existential. Yes, what happens for us in Mexico is existential. Unfortunately, we're doing nothing about it. Our borders are open. The drug cartels now control the borders. We don't. Millions of people are marching into this country. We don't know where they're from. Well, we know generally, but they're not coming with skills or abilities that we necessarily need. And more important, I don't see much evidence these people are remotely interested in becoming Americans. I mean, that used to be the principal motivation. If you go back 100 years, everybody's trying to get here desperately to become an American. How often do you hear that? I never hear it at all. So, the whole thing is on its head. And we're worried about what's happening in Ukraine. What we should be doing is worrying about how do we forge or craft a solution that both sides can live with. Let's go back to what Putin said at the beginning. See what he's still willing to do. Because at this point, remember, he's done a lot of damage to the Ukrainians. How much willingness is there to stick with those original objectives, or is he going to demand more? But we've got to end this thing before it gets out of control. And as you move closer to the Polish border, as I'm afraid something like that is going to happen, the more likely you are to have that accident that brings everyone into a war that no one in their right mind wants. And I include, by the way, President Biden in that. I just don't think he knew what he was doing when he made his speech in Warsaw. He looks foolish and stupid. But I guess, again, what you're going to see is more and more Europeans say, well, we didn't sign on for a regime change war. Yeah. We haven't signed on for a potential nuclear confrontation in Europe. I mean, I think Europeans, the support base that we're characterizing as strong and unambiguously unified is nonsense. That's going to crumble. And the same thing is true when you look at the sanctions. Sanctions are another form of warfare. And that's why this ruble contract is a wonderful riposte, if you will, by the Russians. They're turning it right around. Because the Europeans can't go for a month or 2 months or 3 months right now without Russian petroleum products and energy. It's impossible. The Germans have said so. Others have said so. So they know if they do, they're going to have hundreds of thousands of their citizens, if not millions, in the streets. They're going to have a 1789 experience. Right. So the bottom line is, I think all of this is going to crumble, but this is kind of the last gasp of the globalist elite. Because if Russia is allowed to be successful in what it set out to do in Ukraine, it gets a neutral state, or you get a territorial arrangement with a neutral state that's different, then the message is clear and unambiguous to the world. The unipolar moment is over. The United States cannot bully everyone everywhere all the time. Russia is not Iraq.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that this is something I try to really try to persuade people of is that I think there's this unipolar moment or American dominance, America is number one, a kind of attitude in our culture has it's been so intertwined with the American identity that I try to remind people that the unipolar moment has not been good for the average American. This has not helped you at all. There's no evidence that there was any benefit to the world or to the average American person in the idea that we run the world and we have global hegemony or whatever they want to call something that to me kind of looks a lot more like a world empire, but okay. What does this do? What does this do for the average American that's supposed to be, benefiting from this? And I think that, and one of the things to go back to, you saying that there is this kind of encouraging sign that people are waking up to some degree. Tucker Carlson is really the only guy on TV who's been talking about this and telling the truth, or at least parts of it. And he's the number one show in cable news. And there is something to that the one guy kind of telling the truth, the people like the most. And that's all this is. I mean, look, whatever it is, the American people are just being lied to about what's going on here. The idea that we're supporting Ukraine because they're such a democracy. That's just because we love democracy so much, even though, they overthrew a democratically elected government way back in 2014, even though they've banned other political parties and imprisoned political opponents and absorbed, news outlets under the state apparatus, this is still some thriving democracy. Oh, and by the way, don't focus on how the Donbass region and Crimea in 2015 voted to be ruled by Russia, not Ukraine. Don't worry about that. Democracy doesn't apply to that. And by the way, the people who love democracy so much and just have such bleeding hearts for the loss of life. We're happy to partner with the Saudis to conduct a war in Yemen, but we don't seem to have any concern about a war there where far more people have been dying for quite a bit longer in a much poorer country. It's just, there's just so much that if you just look at it objectively, the official narrative collapses under the weight of even a little bit of truth, like just that little bit of truth right there. The official narrative collapses. So hopefully people like you keep getting out there and telling the American people the truth, and they wake up about some of this stuff.